thank you all for being here, and thanks to Heidi for the invitation and to the whole group. I'm really excited to be here because, I mean, as Akain said, I work at the University of the Basque Country, but I'm usually in Vitoria over at the linguistics department, although I'm a philosopher, so I'm happy to be doing something with philosophers at the philosophy department. I normally, most of my work at Lindy Lab, Language and Neurodiversity, is about autism, and I'm going to talk a lot about autism today as well. But this paper is a work in progress, and it's something I'm working on more like on my own, and it's more conceptual and more general. So it's about the relation between diagnosis and identity, and like how we can think about that relation in a bit more systematic way. So I'm just gonna start with, okay, great. So I'm just gonna start like setting the stage a little with some examples from first-person accounts of individuals who have received psychiatric diagnoses, and also from like recent discussions in philosophy of psychiatry in a debate that's usually known under the label self-illness. Okay, I can use this. That's great. Thank you. Self-illness ambiguity. So my aim is to like underscore the different roles that acquiring a psychiatric diagnosis may play with respect to personal and social identity. And yeah, I'm going to start with self-illness ambiguity just because it's a thing that's been talked about a lot in philosophy of psychiatry in the past like 3 or 4 years. And here I'm just going to define it very like crudely, but then I'm going to go a bit more into that definition. So the idea is that self-illness ambiguity is the relationship between who one is, so the self, quote unquote, again, I'm just going to make it more nuanced in a little bit, and their mental condition, so the illness again, quote unquote. And so what initially got me thinking about this topic is that the examples that are discussed in this literature on self-illness ambiguity usually focus on cases such as the following. So people talking about their illness in terms of not feeling like themselves. So here's one example from depression. People describe not being their usual self. They feel that something isn't right. They are uncertain about whether what they were experiencing is simply a problem in everyday life or a problem requiring medical attention. Or cases of ambiguity in which one is uncertain of whether a certain trait or symptom is caused by themselves or by their illness. And so here again, some reports from this debate. So I feel like everything I do is now somehow connected to my being sick. Again, there's a person diagnosed with bipolar depression. If I'm happy, it's because I'm manic. If I'm sad, it's because I'm depressed. I don't want to think that every time I have an emotion, every time I get angry at somebody, it's because I'm ill. Some of my feelings are justified. People say I'm a different person every day, but that's me. I've never been a stable person. So there's this ambiguity that people are talking about. But there's also, and these are going to be the case I'm going to focus on, a very different perspective that's been pushed by, for instance, people who are diagnosed with autism when they're adults. So here there are a few first-person accounts I want to read to you. So people say, when I got the diagnosis of autism as an adult woman, it just clicked into place. I found there were other people like me. I was not the only one. Diagnosis as a child would have made a difference because I would have understood myself better, been able to have a more positive autistic identity rather than feeling like a part of it was missing. And again, people talking about pre-diagnosis, seeing themselves in a certain way, like a misfit, a retarded genius, an eccentric, a freak, and then the spectrum gave me a new identity, which I view as mostly positive. And so you see that it's a very different way of approaching the same issue of, well, there's a diagnosis and there's me, there's myself. And here's another excerpt from Anna Gatsby's recent memoir. She's a stand-up comedian who got really successful in the past few years. And she was also diagnosed with autism when she was in her late 30s. And she says, this diagnosis, autism and ADHD in her case, have given me a pathway to understanding myself. For the first time in my life, I'm able to like who I am. And then she's like, before the diagnosis, I always worked under the impression that I would eventually find my way to the starting line of normal. But then after being diagnosed, I realized that I actually had a very warped sense of what being normal actually was. So again, like a path to self-understanding, a way of liking themselves more. And here's yet another way, and here's another first-person account that I really like by Ellen Sachs, who's the author of a very beautiful memoir on schizophrenia called The Center Cannot Hold. And also, I mean, this is part from her book and part from a recent talk that she gave earlier this year. And she talks about her diagnosis of schizophrenia in these terms. So she's like, I have a major mental illness. I will never fully recover from schizophrenia. I will always need to be on antipsychotic medication and talk therapy. I will always have good days and bad. I still get sick. And she talks about having a relationship with her illness. So the illness is still there, but then she's going through therapy and treatment, and so she's more in control. It's not pushing me around as before. And so she sees the illness in a way as a part of herself. So this is just like to set the stage, as I said, with some first-person accounts, but the idea is that there seems to be several elements that can be reconciled or disentangled in the relationship between individuals and their psychiatric diagnosis. And maybe, I mean, at first blush, what we see from the reports is that there is some distancing move. So I don't feel like myself, I want to know why. And now I know why after the diagnosis. Identification moves, so new autistic identity. Incorporation moves, so schizophrenia is a part of me, just as a first approximation. But so things are probably more complex than the self-illness ambiguity debate initially made us think. And that's like a criticism that has been already raised within the literature. So the idea is that, well, maybe both elements of this relation, so the self and the illness, are not like some reifications, like something that's like ready-made and it's there, but like things that can be in a complex relationship with one another. So they're not like two objects, but things that they can like co-constitute each other. And I'm just going to try and unpack that idea a bit more in the rest of the talk. So the starting point is the idea that this sort of relationship is very complex and it's worth exploring more. So the aim or their like rough roadmap for the talk will be like these two like leading questions. So how can we think about more systematically about the effects that receiving the psychiatric diagnosis has on identity, and how we can do so in a way that does justice to the complex and context-dependent variability that people seem to experience, right? Because that's part of what we want to do. And so the goal is kind of modest, so I want to like move some preliminary steps towards a finer-grained account of this relationship, and I'm going to do that by talking about diagnosis in two ways. First, diagnosis as a process, and then diagnosis as a status. As you'll see, there's like a lot of moving parts, and so I'm looking forward to your feedback in the Q&A session, but it's still like things I'm working through and hopefully will be like at least understandable. Okay, so starting with diagnosis as a process, I'm just gonna draw on some work that's been done in philosophy of information, basically here on Florida's very influential book. And so I want to try and see the diagnostic process as a process in which an individual is seeking to acquire a body of information about themselves, right? So that's going to be kind of the starting point, and that has several ramifications. What's already peculiar is that there are third parties that are usually involved in this search, right? So more directly, there's like medical professionals or teams of people who have authority over this process and over the outcome. And there's all the issue of like misdiagnosis, self-diagnosis that's like kind of lingering in the background here. I'm not gonna like touch upon that directly, but it's something that we can discuss because it's clearly one concern. And also more indirectly, so like significant others, the society at large that's pushing a person towards seeking a diagnosis in the first place. And then there's of course individual motivations for doing that, which is what I'm gonna explore more today. So, thinking about diagnosis as a process, I think we can distinguish, at least like artificially, qua philosophers, between like these two levels. So there's a more like epistemological and a more like value-laden level. So when I talk here about epistemological, I mean like how the search for information is understood, what it uncovers for the person who's looking for the diagnostic information, but that there's also like a more like value-laden level, like different attitudes, appraisals, preferences about the outcome. And I don't really believe these two can be like neatly separated, and there's a slide about that. But I'll try to do so like in what follows as an effort to like clarify the whole like landscape here. So epistemically, I mean, this is like the three approaches I found so far. There's probably others, but thinking about the reports we saw in the first part, I think you can capture what goes on in a diagnostic process as follows. So there's situations in which psychiatric diagnosis plays an explanatory role, revelatory and transformative. And I just have like one slide each to try and unpack this a bit more. So if we approach diagnosis in an explanatory fashion, here what we want to say is that we interpret the search as a search for causes, right? So think about the example of the person with depression, right? So I don't feel like myself, something has changed in my mental life, and I want to understand why I feel and behave in a way that I don't really recognize as myself, right? And so through the diagnostic process, the person tries to make sense of significant psychological and emotional changes, such as the loss of motivation towards everyday interests and activities. And in these contexts, I think people look for a diagnosis exactly because they feel like they're not being their usual self and that something isn't right. So the main goal here will be something like, oh, I want to revert to like who I was before, I want to manage the symptoms, I want to recover, right? So a more or less implicit kind of endorsement of a more like medical model of that condition. But things are very different when we approach diagnosis in a more like revelatory fashion. So maybe here what people are looking for is a source of validation or increased self-understanding. So why I am different from others, and diagnosis gives you that in a way. So think about the initial examples of autism in adulthood. So the person acquires a deeper understanding of their identity through the diagnosis. And so this is really far from expressing the idea that something has changed within the person. Actually, you find like insight into like who you were all along through that tool of the diagnostic label. And so that also in some cases clarifies your relation to others and to the world. So think about, again, people saying it all clicked into place. The first 50 years of my life made sense. That's also the title of a paper. So the main goal here will be something like self-understanding, seeking a community of support, or things like that. But I want to try and say that there's also something different going on if we approach diagnosis in a more transformative fashion, right? So in some cases, it seems like the diagnostic process is at least partially responsible for the creation of a new identity. And so I thought I was X, but I am Y. So think about, again, some of the excerpts from autism in adulthood and the schizophrenia example here. So through a diagnostic process, the person acquires either a new identity or a part of a new identity. And I take this to be like a more constitutive process because it modifies your relationship not only with other people, but also with yourself, right? So think about the person who said, I viewed myself as a misfit, a retarded genius, a freak, but the spectrum gave me a new identity. And there were different aspects of myself that I couldn't integrate. This is Ellen Sachs on her schizophrenia diagnosis. And now she has a relationship with her illness. And so the nature of this process, I want to say, is something like in between like a discovery and a construction, because there's, of course, a discovery element as well. So, I mean, it's partially revelatory, perhaps. But there's also a more active construction part. So the person, we were talking with Nara earlier about like negotiating aspects, right, of your identity. And that's probably what goes on in these cases. But what about the value laden? So we talked about the epistemological up to now. So there's different attitudes, appraisals, and preferences at play. And I don't want to say there's a one-to-one mapping between positive and negative valence and type of process. But I think that some combinations are more likely to appear than others. So if you do approach diagnosis in an explanatory way, there's some sort of negative valence that appears to be built in with respect to your condition, right? And as I said, there's a more or less explicit adherence to the medical model here. And so the idea that you're searching for an underlying dysfunction, something that's wrong with you. As opposed to what happens in the revelatory and the transformative approaches, because it seems like there's room for positive and negative appraisals in both cases. So here in the revelatory example, like of a negative valence, what I have in mind is addiction, right? So one can identify very strongly with being an alcoholic and go to AA meetings and stuff like that, but still view being an alcoholic as a very negative thing, although they do identify with that thing, right? And so it seems like both enhanced self-understanding and a sense of belonging are compatible with a positive and negative assessment of a newfound identity. And the attitude here, I would say the emphasis is more on discovery than on construction. Whereas in the transformative cases, there's, again, room for positive and negative appraisals, but the new identity seems to be like more actively constructed and negotiated by the person as opposed to the like revelatory cases. And here's, one of the many moving parts, but my suspicion is that the different attitudes that one might have a lot to do, for instance, with things like time. So like the kind of condition and how long that condition like has been present in your life, right? So it makes a difference whether the condition you're diagnosed with is something like neurodevelopmental, such as autism, so that's been like a part of you or like who you are forever, or something episodic, some like an episode of major depression, or something chronic like schizophrenia, so something that emerges at one point in your life, but then it's like there to stay. And some cases of mood disorders as well, because of course we also have like chronic depression and chronic mental illnesses. So I think it's more or less difficult to separate yourself, so like from your diagnosis in a way, so the elements of the relationship here are the self and the diagnosis, depending on whether a contrast class is available. So as an autistic person, I don't really have a picture of myself as non-autistic, right? Whether as a depressed person, I do have a picture of myself like when I was not depressed. So I think like time plays a major role here. And I think, this is something I haven't developed yet, but I think there's probably a possible parallel here with some somatic conditions that might be worth exploring. So chronic somatic illness as opposed to like something like cancer or a physical disability that's been with you like since birth, right? But yeah, I'm not exploring it here, but it's just something I've been thinking about while I was developing this part. Okay, and then like besides time, which is like what I mostly focus on, there's of course individual choices and preferences. So people like Sachs say, well, it makes my life better if I think about myself as someone with a serious mental illness and not as a schizophrenic, which is like a part of my identity in a stronger sense. And other people say, well, schizophrenia is like a cut or a bruise in your brain. It's something you take care of. It's not you. And so probably for these people, that's what works best in terms of individual choice and preference. But there's, of course, very different views on that as well. And then there's this like huge thing I'm going to talk about more in the second part of the talk, which I couldn't really describe in a neat fashion, so I just called it like the socio-cultural material context of reference. So that's like the environment, basically. So the relevance and valence that's assigned to a given category in a social, cultural, material context in which a person is embedded. So let's say a specific stigma or prejudice that's attached to a given condition, some like unique barrier that a person can encounter, family of origin culture that can be very, very influential here, socioeconomic status, access to services, like all that is part of this very big box of sociocultural material context. Okay, so to take stock of the first part, like as a kind of a summary slide, in the explanatory approach, diagnosis is supposed to tell you something about what is wrong, underlying dysfunction. No problem. It's also on camera now, so it's great. So yeah, well, and in the explanatory case, valence is typically negative, as I said. The outlook kind of conforms to the medical model. And the condition at stake tends to be episodic as opposed to chronic or neurodevelopmental. In the revelatory case, diagnosis tells you something about you, improves an understanding of who you are. Valence may be positive or negative, and that depends on individual and social factors. The condition tends to be neurodevelopmental or personality-based. So here I have in mind also like personality disorders such as borderline or things like that. In the transformative case, diagnosis tells you something that modifies your identity and the relationship with yourself. Again, valence may be positive or negative, same as in the revelatory case, and condition tends to be more neurodevelopmental or chronic. So there's maybe that difference here that's worth unpacking. All right, and now moving on to the second part of the talk, diagnosis as a status. So now you have received your diagnosis, you have that label, and I think there's like an entirely new set of questions that opens up if we see diagnosis as a search of information about yourself, right? So, for instance, what to do with the acquired information, who it belongs to, who has the right to access it, and how and whether one should disclose it. And that's like an entire different set of questions that I think it's interesting to at least raise here. And here again, I appeal to Florida's view on the nature of personal information. And Florida says that for a long time in the philosophy of information, there's been this idea that personal information was some sort of material possession, like something you owned. But now people are shifting more towards the idea that it's a constitution view. So your personal information is what constitutes part of your identity to different degrees. And so diagnosis, if we see it as what, for instance, Erving Goffman called like a master status, so like something like gender or ethnicity, sexual orientation or things like that, is a body of information and has at least the potential to be identity defining, right? And I think we can see that if we consider the fact that acquiring a diagnosis exhibits a dual nature that may lead to positive and or negative outcomes. So after you've acquired a diagnosis, you have access, hopefully, to support, intervention, and care. You can improve your self-understanding. You can open up new paths of affiliation with communities in your environment. But at the same time, you're also more vulnerable to stigma, discrimination. You're exposed to unwanted harm due to like the social material circumstances and to structural systems of oppression and injustice. And so these outcomes are not really equally distributed, but they rather depend on very complex contextual factors. So one can get like the more positive or the more negative or a mix of the two, depending on many things. And I'm going to try and just unpack a couple of these. So what I'm trying to like move more towards is the idea that what diagnosis gives you is the idea that you have a collection of traits, X. That can be like neutral in terms of valence. But then the impact that having that collection of traits, X, has on your life is something that's really different. And that doesn't really depend on the label, but on this other, very big like container of like environment, social, cultural, material circumstances. Here I'm just gonna have a couple of examples up here on gender as one of these variables that affects like the impact that a certain diagnosis has on you. So let's take autism again, and to like oversimplify, we can say that some typical traits in autism are things like restricted and intense interest or difficulties with social relationships, right? But the impact that these traits have on, just to like use a fictional example, a male CEO in tech is very different from the kind of impact that they have on a young mother, for instance, right? Probably. And similarly with borderline personality disorder, maybe let's say the collection of traits is impulsiveness, explosive reactions of rage. But let's assume like you're a teenage girl or a teenage boy. Well, that has a different impact on how that kind of collection of traits is perceived. And it's probably not a surprise that 70% of BPD diagnoses are made on young women, right? Because these traits are more pathologized when it comes to young women as opposed to men, for instance. These are just like a couple of examples, but there's of course many more that we can talk about. So this resembles what Barnes says about her relational view of disability. So the idea is that disability is not positive or negative, it's neutral. It's what surrounds disability that make it positive or negative in different circumstances, of course. Okay, how am I doing? Time?
25 minutes.
Oh, I have time. Okay, good. Okay, so I can just go a bit slower here. Okay, so here, when I talked about who has access to the information, when you should disclose it, I was mostly concerned with practices of concealment and disclosure that is interesting to discuss, especially if we see diagnostic status as some sort of master status. So if we do think that acquiring a diagnosis as the same status as being of a certain gender or ethnicity or having a certain sexual orientation, then it makes sense to have that sort of parallel, and people are talking about that. For instance, about concealing or revealing your disability and being in or out of the closet with respect to your disability, with respect to your sexual orientation or other aspects of your identity as well. So in a way, disability might have more in common with the social categories such as race or gender in terms of hiding and concealing practices, and also difficulties in navigating access to your community of reference. And we know that because we know that there's a lot of strategies of passing and masking when disabilities are less visible, both in the somatic cases such as deafness or blindness, so there's reports about that. And then there's the big topic of autistic camouflaging, right? So the idea that some autistic people use these strategies to pretend to be neurotypical, or at least to appear neurotypical in some circumstances by suppressing some traits, for instance, such as self-stimulation, or by imitating other people and practicing conversation in advance, having scripts that they apply to social settings to navigate them better. And so these analogies in turn raise other issues about whether these practices are desirable or permissible. And this is a debate that's been had in gender and race studies for a long time. So is disclosing always desirable and empowering? Are concealing, passing, and masking always impermissible? Assimilationist, the marks of a sellout. So this is a recent movie. I don't know if you've watched it, but it's about passing from an ethnic perspective. So it's a light-skinned African-American woman who passes as white in the 1920s. And I mean, this second idea is really there in the movie. So this woman is doing something that's kind of very wrong and betraying her community by passing as white, right? And I think these questions become pressing when it comes to disability, also in light of some recent social media campaigns such as #TakeTheMaskOff or self-help books like this one that are geared towards visibility and unmasking, so teaching people how to minimize the effects of autistic camouflaging, for instance, right? So, of course, I think these are praiseworthy attempts, but there's a risk in treating things that way, and I'm gonna try and argue for this view in a couple of slides. But first, I want to show you some data on concealment and disclosure of psychiatric diagnoses that I think are interesting to look at, just to understand that people are, as it often happens, a lot more nuanced in their practices than philosophers take them to be. So two of these papers are on autism, one is on depression and schizophrenia, and they're qualitative interviews where people talk about when they conceal or disclose their diagnoses in different areas of their lives, so at the workplace and at home or stuff like that. And these studies uncover a broad spectrum of experiences that goes from full concealment to full disclosure, and there's several gray areas, so several strategies that people use. So people talk about keeping safe in some situations to protect yourself from stigma, qualified deception to navigate difficult situations, education when they want to inform others about their difference. And they have a complex and very selective information management strategies that can employ simultaneously in different contexts. And unsurprisingly, the workplace is one of the most difficult contexts to navigate, because for most people, it's the context in which stigma is strongest and they're afraid of being like discriminated against or to being perceived not as capable if they disclose their disability. And there's, here's an example on academia, for example. Many professors who have autism choose not to tell their colleagues. They say that too few people, even among faculty members, understand the diagnosis. If they reveal it, they will be pitted or perceived as less capable. So that's just one example on academia, but there's many others. And people also talk about this double burden, right? So there's the burden of secrecy in case like they choose not to disclose, and there's the burden of being out. So if they are not disclosing, then they always have to, for instance, explain what autism is and just, fight misconceptions, and that's also very, very time and energy consuming to do. So here I'm referring to a very interesting paper on passing by Silverman, who's a philosopher, who talks about a very complex trade-off to navigate when you pass, right? So especially if you belong to different communities, you always have advantages and disadvantages when you pass or you choose not to pass. And then, going back to those social, cultural, material factors, there's also people talking about different privacy styles that are based on their family or previous life experiences. So for instance, this respondent says, like, in my family, we don't talk about anything. So for him, it's like normal just not to disclose because that's how he grew up. And then there's different goals in different circumstances, right? So sometimes you just want to be accepted. You just want to feel normal. You look for support. You want to avoid stigma or harm. You want to normalize your different. You want to make your difference visible. And people choose how to navigate these different contexts by using these different strategies with different goals. And, okay, well, so I think that given all this complexity, it seems a bit misguided to frame the issue of concealment and disclosure solely as an individual responsibility, right? So that's kind of the point I want to get to and close in the talk. So thinking about the campaigns or the self-help books I talked about, there's sort of an inherent risk in considering all these things like an individual issue, right? Because, there you go, back. And to simplify, I just chose to call this risk like the Thatcher-Reagan risk. So the idea that there's no society, there's just individuals. And so the idea is that it's a familiar trap of placing the burden on the individual instead of redressing the more fundamental structural issues. So from the perspective of the individual, passing, concealing, non-disclosing may be reframed as ways of looking out for yourself. So of protecting yourself, it's a normal protective reaction due to what the circumstances are, or even as acts of resistance. So you don't really get to know who I am if, I don't choose to tell you, right? So, okay, retracing the steps, and then we can discuss. Okay, I hope I at least showed you that the relationship between diagnosis and identity is fraught with complexities, and this applies both to diagnosis as a process with its epistemological and value-laden components, and to its outcome. So when diagnosis becomes a status, and at all these levels of analysis, there's individual motivations and preferences that are inevitably intersecting with this social, material, cultural conditions. And then psychiatric diagnoses are probably better seen as very dynamic objects that are constantly co-constructed and negotiated by the individual and by third parties. So clinicians, but also the society at large in specific contexts. And there's a bunch of open questions, but I'm just gonna rehearse some of them. So I think this way of seeing the relationship between diagnosis and identity as consequences, for instance, not only for self-indus ambiguity, which is probably a debate that needs to be a bit more nuanced, but also for medical and social models of disability, and also for what psychiatric diagnoses are. And something that's kind of close to my heart, the role of psychiatry as a discipline. Because if you approach diagnosis in an explanatory fashion, like the first model, it's pretty clear that psychiatry has a role to play there as a medical discipline. But if you approach diagnosis in a more transformative or revelatory fashion, it's unclear that, first off, what you're diagnosing is a mental disorder in the first place, and second, what kind of medical discipline are you, if that's the sort of like tension that's there, but I don't have an answer to that. And then, I mean, on a more like political note, something that I'm like thinking about when I see these campaigns and I see like this familiar trap and this risk is like, what kind of actions, like intellectual and collective actions we can take to just spread awareness that this is a very complex issue and that there is this familiar trap of like blaming the individual or like asking the individual to make changes as opposed to like change at a more like structural level as a society. Okay, I hope I didn't rush through it too much, but this is what I had. Thank you, and I welcome your questions and comments, doubts, whatever.
Good. So we have plenty of time for questions, comments, discussion. Yeah, Maria.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for the talk. That was super cool and very interesting. So I have like a small question and something that's more like, I don't know if it's a question or a comment. So the first one is, you mentioned gender.
Yeah.
I mean, at several points you start talking about how autism affects different women and females or female. Yeah. But of course, the example you give is like the difference between, at some point you talk about a male CEO, the tech, and a young mother, and I wonder, no, that doesn't seem to be a gender issue. I mean, difference would also be a female CEO and a young mother, right? Seems to be, so I was like, that doesn't seem to be, that was, so is there really a difference? Like at the beginning you were talking about these women saying, when you get diagnosed of autism, it really, are there some studies that indicate whether that's different for females or males or women or men? I don't know how that goes.
Right.
Are there really is there really a difference? Are there studies that indicate?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks for the question, because it's something like I sort of like glossed over, but it's really complex. Yeah. So when it comes to like autism, like late diagnosed autism, there's now a lot of work being done on women or people who identify as women, but the idea is that, there's different ways of approaching the issue. So there's people who think that there's a female phenotype of autism, so it presents differently in women, which is not my view, but surely there has been the assumption, and there still is the assumption, that autism is primarily a male condition, and that has brought women to be underdiagnosed or misdiagnosed for a long time. And only like in recent years, we started to understand that, well, maybe, there was camouflaging happening, and so like some traits were hidden, and that's why the diagnosis didn't happen. Or maybe not because of I didn't want to seem like an essentialist when I talked about gender, maybe because of the social pressures and the kind of, for instance, to be more sociable. That's one of, the main things, right? So one of the dimensions to diagnose autism is difficulties with social relationships. And we all know that young girls are pushed to be more social, for instance, women are pushed to be more social. And that probably makes a difference in terms of like how you behave. And since the diagnosis of autism is, to this day, purely behavioral, lots of women were misdiagnosed and underdiagnosed. And that's why now this is changing, and there's a lot of discussion on why that is. But there's more or less, essentialist position in there. And there's definitely people who claim that there is a different expression of the condition, which is not how I would put it for sure. But I think there are different social pressures, and that produces a different way. At least, up to now, because probably now that girls are diagnosed at a younger age, it will change in 30 years. But if we look at 30 years ago, it was very different. Yeah. So I think that's the idea. But no, the CEO and it's not about like gender per se, but it's about like the social expectations and pressures related to gender. Yeah, that's the point I wanted to make. But thanks, because it was.
No, I agree. Yeah. Thanks, yeah.
Thank you.
The under-diagnosis, I don't know why I'm not surprised yet.
Yeah. And it's not, I mean, it's not unique to autism, but there's been a lot of research in the past like 5 years, specifically on autism. And that kind of coincided with the boom on like camouflaging studies. And I think I mean, these two things are related because it looks like women do camouflage more, in my opinion, like across the board, neurotypical or non-neurotypical, and that probably impacted the rate of diagnosis. Thank you.
Can I make my second question? Or? Okay, I had
Well, mine wasn't follow-up.
Okay,
So
Heidi,
Heidi,
yeah, mine was completely different. So, yeah.
So Heidi, please.
Yeah, no, so I'm just curious, right, because it used to be like 1 in 4
Yeah.
women compared to men
Yes.
with autism.
Yes.
And interesting, it's about the same with psychopathy as well, right? So few
Yeah.
women are diagnosed with psychopathy, but men are much more likely to be diagnosed
Yeah.
with psychopathy.
Yeah.
And I'm just, is that changing
In autism, it's changing. So the classic epidemiological studies say 4 to 1, and now there's like, I mean, it depends on the study, but it's now closer to like 3 to 1, and in some studies even 2 to 1. And I mean, my hunch is that it will change kind of massively in the next decades.
equal or still like maybe
I mean, I don't know, but surely like more equal. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it's.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, I mean, in a similar way, like in psychopathy, there's some attempts of explaining why there might be fewer
Right.
female psychopaths, right? So one explanation could simply be that if you use the Hare psychopathy checklist, what you have is you have a lot of criminal and violent behavior, right?
Yeah.
And then women will tend to be more manipulative, but in a way that's
Yeah.
not overtly criminal
Yeah.
in the same way, right? So you could have essentially a 50-50 split.
Yeah.
Then there's another view that holds that the threshold for fear in women is much higher, like that much lower, so women feel fear much more quickly, and there seems to be a lot of self-defensive mechanisms involved in expressions of empathy and so forth and so on, right? So you see the startle response in women with psychopathy is much larger than in men with psychopathy, right? So there too, you have to sort of, is it one or the other?
Yeah. Yeah, in the case of autism, I mean, yeah, the two big things, like two big dimensions are like repetitive behaviors and restricted interests. And there are very interesting studies on girls and boys diagnosed with autism. And what the studies found is that basically for the girls, the interests were like very, like much more like commonplace stuff, like reading or like even like social relationship were like one of the special interests of many of the girls. And so they're sort of like flying under the radar more easily just because they seem to adapt more to what's like, you know, perceived as normal interest to have. And again, I think that's, you know, a topic of like a matter of social pressures probably. Whereas, you know, the kind of like lone boy who's interested in dinosaurs, and it's the more typical case there. And then, of course, I mean, the other dimension is social relationships. So again, on some views, it's something like women are like naturally better at. In some other views, it's like something that's a product of much more complex pressures and tensions in the social environment. So yeah, maybe like afterwards they do score higher on the social measures. And that's also why when a girl is usually diagnosed as a child with autism, it's a more severe case. So it's a more like extreme case of autism, if we want to use that, because it's like spotted more easily.
Well, I mean, if you look at the Baron, just one more. Look at Baron Cohen, right? His extreme male hypothesis, right? His tests are actually, when he talks about play, he uses toys that boys tend to play with more than girls. So already, you know what I mean? You're gonna have something that's skewed.
Exactly. Yeah. So the typical like lining up cars or stuff like that. Yeah.
Maria,
There
you
was-
had another
If there's some other question, I can,
So, so go.
You did touch on the, well, First of all, thanks for the presentation. It was really interesting.
Well, for you, it's actually the second time you hear it, so.
Yes,
Yeah, it's a revised version of what you heard in June, but yeah.
So you did touch on this on the presentation, but I wanted to ask whether you could expand a bit more on like the effects that in the process of diagnosis, especially on the last one, on diagnosis as transformative, could it have the social dichotomy that, for me at least, tends to exist pretty clearly between the diagnoses that are considered to be more demonized from an emotional regulation perspective, and those that tend to be more that spark a reaction of paternalistic attitudes. Because the way I see it, for example, using the examples that you use between BPD, for example, versus autism, it's true that BPD tends to have this kind of visceral reaction of people seeking a cure almost, or kind of similar to bipolar, where you could think, well, I'm so unstable, like I need to fit into this society because all of my reactions to my diagnosis are basically like creating kind of a barrier for me to access anything really, because the stigma is so high that I couldn't really possibly, take like kind of pride in a borderline identity because it's seen as so like such a violent thing almost, right? Versus diagnosis as autism, where I do think that the social kind of reaction to it tends to be much more of that of like paternalization, of infantilizing, of taking agency as opposed to demonizing, which I think are two processes that can really like, I don't know if my question was clear.
No, I think it's a very interesting thought. And I haven't really, when I was thinking about the various condition, I really haven't thought about, when I touch upon the temporal perspective, it's something like a bit like that. Because as usual, the personality disorders are always the hardest. I'm looking at Heidi. Because personality disorders are there's traits we all share, but they're in extreme in a way or another. So they're more dimensional, and so it's way more difficult. Both to identify with them, but also to be perceived as having a disorder. And so it's because people are well, for borderline, for instance, why do you have to be manipulative? You can just choose not to be, but it's we know it's not the case, but it's very difficult to disentangle all that. Maybe it could be another along with the temporal dimension, so something that's been with you your whole life or not, it can be another thing that plays a role in how one interacts with their diagnosis, right? For instance, I think in Sachs' case with schizophrenia, that plays a role, right? Because schizophrenia is really stigmatized, and it's usually perceived as very the opposite of normal in a way, the hallucination, delusions part. And so I think that's probably why for her it makes sense to see it as a part of herself that she's kind of taken care of, as opposed to her whole identity. But for instance, I didn't use them in the talk, but I have in mind some reports of borderline people that seem to have a more revelatory approach. So, finally I understand that this is who I am, and this kind of puts all these behaviors that were stigmatized and demonized by people. I see them in a different light now because I understand that's so in a way I would probably put the borderline more in the revelatory camp. But I agree, it makes also a difference in terms of how the diagnosis is perceived by others. I think it's a point I have to think about more. Thanks.
If I can add something to that. I was thinking also on for example, this diagnosis that is becoming quite a thing right now, autistic people of I think it's called a pathological demand avoidance. Whereas this is kind of one of those diagnoses where it's pretty clear to me how the stigma is put in when the diagnosis really conforms something that socially is considered to be negative, which is
absolutely.
saying no to advances.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So for
Being
example,
overwhelmed.
Yeah. So for example, I do have this hunch of thinking that maybe those diagnoses that are considered to be much more, demonized are those that tend to have much more of an expansive quality to them, where like your clash with the social aspect of your life is more evident than with the typical idea associated with autism, maybe of like, this solitude or this like sensory experience but alone. Whereas more and more as we expand like the criteria of diagnosis in autism, we are seeing that there are like bits of sparkles of this kind of like pushback from psychiatry or trying to diagnose things that weren't really considered to be a big deal. As soon as it's considered to be like a clash with the social aspect.
I mean, that's like, the huge like underlying question of like, what's a pathology, what's a mental pathology in terms of like, that's, I mean, a big part of the social models, right? Saying, well, it's part of the environment and the demands of the environment that make something a disability as opposed to like the trait per se. So no, definitely. Thank you.
Maria?
We go back to you.
I was completely lost in my. So I don't know if it's a question or comment but I come from like philosophy, like for us, what I meant to say is, usually when you think about personal identity, you can either think about, so if you're diagnosed with autism or something like that, you seem to be at some point you realize you understand yourself, you get to know who you are and blah, blah, blah. But I was wondering if with other kind of psychiatric, or whether you have something to say about other cases where actually, so say if you have amnesia, it's not only that you don't know what kind of person you are, if you don't know what person you are, you lost yourself. Like, thinking about personal identity through time. And I assume there are things like bipolar extreme cases, things like that.
Sure.
You might think you're two people, or you get lost. You don't really know which of these two people you are.
Dissociative identity.
So in that very stronger sense of identity.
Right. Sure.
And well, I just wanted to I don't know. I don't really know. Does your analysis apply to that case, or is there like? Because I assume it's a much more strong. It's a different.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
I haven't really, I mean, in this particular reflection, I haven't really thought about like things like dissociative identity disorder, so not like about identity in that respect, but more about like, I mean, still for time, but more like assuming you're.
Yeah, but I was thinking because
like in a complex way, like oneself, because I think in the DID cases, well, I mean, the self becomes even more complex because there's probably multiple selves. I mean, that's the usual view that there are multiple selves and like multiple like fully formed.
So you don't even know which
fully formed personality, and there's usually like no memory continuity between them, so you don't remember what you did when you were that other person. So, I mean, it's probably an even more complex case, which
Because in this case, it's more like, okay, now I know who I am, in the sense that I understand better my personality, I understand why I did certain things, why I don't do. But in other cases,
well,
like,
or in the transformative case, you take like a further step and say, well, now like through this diagnosis, I can, add this part of myself, or I can.
But you still.
But you still. I have this more like, let's say, straightforward. Examples in mind, but of course, I mean.
That's why it's not even a question. It was just a comment.
No, but that's right. This is.
I don't know if I understood the question very well, so maybe what I'm saying has nothing to do with it, but there are these theories on personal identity that understand personal identity in terms of the narration.
The narrative,
Maria Shepman and these people, for example. Maybe that, if I got the question correctly, maybe that could work as a bridge between the two things or topics or issues or whatever.
Iteration, you mean like you are
Narration.
narration? Oh, yeah.
The story you tell yourself about who you are.
Yeah, that comes from Locke, right? He said it was a question of memory, of thinking of yourself as yourself across time.
Yeah.
So you have memories of yourself doing things in the
Right.
past as yourself.
Yeah.
So that like
Yeah.
self capacity of reflection,
Yeah,
which of
think
course
you have
for
in
Locke.
mind something else, right? So there's the hardcore narrativity theory, which is different from the, because
Yeah,
that's a story that you're telling yourself.
Exactly, that's
But
what
Mariah Schechtman actually has some interesting work because she says, look, you're the same person if you can empathize or identify with yourself in the past. So she would allow for pretty radical breaks in identity, like if you really shift, you know what I mean?
So in DID, you would feel empathy when you're like that person with that person in the past, but it's not a requirement that you would feel empathy for the other, like, X personalities that you have. Okay.
So instead of self
Yeah.
memory, first person memory, you have first person empathy or something like that. Yeah. Okay.
Well, and maybe through like a more narrative approach, let's assume like you get a diagnosis of DID at one point in time, so like you can have that sort of meta narrative on like, oh well, I am then a person who has 5 personalities and that's who I am. And I mean, maybe that's I don't know if that's the bridge we're talking about, but it can be helpful. I think it can be helpful. It can be helpful to use the narrative. And I mean, it's not something I do. I mean, I've done up to now, but I can probably appeal to some of that stuff.
Now you have a question?
Yes. Thank you. Actually, I have a couple of questions.
Sure.
The first one would be, do you consider any political dimension to all of it? Because identity sometimes can also be kind of, especially when you're diagnosed, you have kind of position in society, you have access to certain resources, you have certain
Absolutely.
rights, obligations, and also disclaimers, I would say. So how, and also, well, as I told you before, I think there is a kind of movement of identity politics to somehow restate the rights of minorities and so on, so diagnosed people could be also
Absolutely. No, No, I think like all these concerns are like part of like the background from which like all of this started. So I think like in this like particular paper, what I would like to do is just show that things are very complex. And so even when you're talking about like when we talk about identity, I mean sometimes it seems like a very as like the self-illness ambiguity, it seems like a very like rarefied object, but it's not. It's something that's extremely complex and connects to like all these other things. And that's probably, I don't know, I mean, I don't think it's overlooked like from people who, express their identity in a certain way. Of course, that can be like empowering and people do it for different reasons. But I think in debates about identity, that's often overlooked. And it seems like this very like this monolith that you are this or that. But I mean, people are like all sorts of different things for all sorts of different reasons. And so that's why I'm saying, like, when I say like the political question at the end, how can we find a way to talk about these things that's a bit more nuanced and more complex? So that's part of my goal, hopefully.
And I go for a second question. I know that you have also written something about the vulnerability paradigm, like how, and you know that there are some people or researchers advocating for shifting from diagnosed to health, like being vulnerable to psychosis, being vulnerable to whatever. How would you relate that with the 3 like processes you were mentioning before? Because it seems that having kind of vulnerability to would be a kind of chronic diagnosis. I don't know how to say, like more transformative than the categorical one. Oh, yeah.
No, I'm laughing because it's always, it's super nice when like other people make connections about your work that you haven't made yourself. And so thank you for that. No, because you're right. I mean, because when I was working on this, I wasn't thinking about vulnerability like at all, but it is relevant. And I think it's relevant also because like a lot of like pushback against the idea that, for instance, vulnerability to psychosis can be like a diagnosis in itself, is the fact that, well, if you're vulnerable, I mean, only like a small percentage of people who are vulnerable to psychosis develop a psychosis. I mean, and even if it's a very significant percentage, and we know it is, there's all these other people who don't. And people can say like vulnerable for a long time, and even like older life, without developing what is known as like a full-fledged. And so, I mean, all these questions about, well, so should these people have access to the same services or, you know, even being prescribed the same medications? It's complex. And that's why, I mean, it's not there yet, although we do have a lot of data for it. I mean, I know the ones on schizophrenia mostly, but that there is this sort of like intermediate syndrome where people have, for instance, like occasional hallucinations or mild psychosis, but they don't really cross the threshold to full-blown schizophrenia, for instance. And there's also for autism, the so-called like broad autism spectrum profile. So people, normally they are family members of people who are diagnosed, siblings. So there's like the genetic element in that too, who like are borderline cases in all effects. And so I think it's very interesting to understand like how we treat these cases, and I made a note, I'll think about them more.
Because I was thinking that like this shift to the vulnerability paradigm can also meet this criteria or answer this question of how we can do what we can do as society. Right. Like shifting these binary positions between you have a diagnosis.
Exactly. Yeah, that's part of why I got interested in that, because I was interested, and I still am, in dimensional models, right? And so the idea is that, like, well, we should move, you know, past the categorical model, but if you, like, endorse that, like, a fully dimensional model, then you have all these, like, gray areas, and it's, like, very important from a clinical viewpoint how you treat these cases and whether you treat them as, you know, something in between, as a non-diagnosed person or as a diagnosed person. And yeah, so I mean, as you said, it can be chronic. Yeah, it can be chronic, but it can also be like a sudden shift from vulnerability to disorder in some cases. So it's, again, it depends. But thanks, I'll think about it more for sure.
Yeah, so it's curious because it's not clear to me that all things that we call mental disorders are such that a person being diagnosed with it has any influence on their identity at all. So it's, with psychopaths, I'm not clear that it does. Right,
Yeah.
so having read some books, some autobiographies by psychopaths, like I realized I was a psychopath, and I'm like, huh.
Yeah.
And then it was like,
But I guess in
fuck it.
I guess in those
I'm
cases,
happy.
it's
Other
relevant
people
to
are
other
suffering,
people.
but I don't give a shit. You know what I mean? I'm happy. You know, I mean that seems to be something like the sort of reaction where you don't see the kind of distress that you see with other disorders.
Yeah.
My hunch is that with narcissism,
Yeah.
you don't get a lot of that, right? Because it's like, I'm great. So, you know,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? So I think that I mean, that would also be interesting probably, right? In understanding what happens in a lot of disorders where it feels so powerful, the way in which you're being diagnosed. So I mean, my feeling is that a bunch of people with psychopathy,
Right.
they camouflage because of the stigma, right? Not because they otherwise,
that's-
are concerned about
Right,
their
right, right,
behavior
Yeah.
in many ways. And I take it that a lot of people with narcissism, certainly people that succeed in getting a lot of attention, right? I mean,
Yeah.
they have a great time. It's if you fail completely to get this attention, then you might have some issues. But it probably wouldn't be with a diagnosis. It would be the fact that other people are not giving you the attention that you think you deserve. So I mean, I think it's an interesting question, right?
Yeah.
To compare the people who are really deeply affected by the
Yeah,
diagnosis in a way that where they feel it's really identity threatening,
Right.
and then other disorders where it just seems like, okay, whatever. I think that's really
Yeah.
puzzling.
Yeah.
At least prima facie puzzling.
Right, no, you're right, I agree with that. I think I went back to this slide, cause psychopathy and narcissism were the cases I had in mind when I wrote this, like significant others or the society at large who plays a role in pushing the person to seek a diagnosis in the first place. So I guess like with psychopathy, many people get diagnosed after they get into like the criminal justice system, right? That's mostly what happens, at least in the famous cases. But also with narcissists, I think it's mostly like other people who are concerned about understanding what's wrong with the person than the person themselves, which probably makes these conditions, I agree, different from others, in which like it's primarily the person who is suffering and wants to find some sort of explanation or self-understanding that's usually kind of absent or like to a very like low degree present in these cases, right? That makes a difference for sure in the diagnostic, how one approaches the diagnostic process. Because if you think there's absolutely nothing wrong with yourself, actually the opposite. It's you rarely see because psychiatric diagnosis, right?
Well, it's so interesting, right?
Yeah.
Because with psychopathy and narcissism, the standard tendency is to think, no, it's other people
Right.
that's the problem,
Yeah.
and that remains very
Yeah.
strong,
Yeah.
right? Whereas with a lot of other people, there's this vulnerability, oh my God, I'm the problem, and then that fight with the internalization, right, of being the issue.
Right, yeah.
Anyway, I have one other question, if that's okay.
Sure.
So I was just, so on the political front, right, I think we all agree that there's a lot of work to be done about destigmatizing. But, being someone who works on psychopathy, right, one might also want to be a little careful, right? Because you don't want psychopaths having, like, just, okay, all right, great, you're a psychopath, you manipulate other people, you humiliate them, you steal their work, you pretend, you know what I mean, et cetera, right? So, there's this interesting, and of course, psychopaths are, I think, probably the most maligned of all the people who are diagnosed, right? And I think even there, we might want to go some way towards having a little bit more of a healthy attitude, sort of a less stigmatizing attitude. But at the same time say, look, we don't want to have bosses who are psychotic. There are certain positions where you don't want certain people with certain disorders to sit in part because of the, their behavior, but also the effect that they have on other people. So, workplaces where the boss is psychopathic, right, it just leads to a massive mental illness amongst the people who are working there, right? And so, it's kind of an interesting, I wonder whether the nuanced way to go would be to say, well, less stigma overall, but an acceptance of some of the workplace limitations that might come with certain kinds of diagnoses.
I think when I try to distinguish between having a set of traits versus the impact that the traits have, that will be one example, right? So, as a psychopath, there's probably like, yeah, I mean, also like workplaces where you would flourish. There's that book, Snakes and Soup. I think you recommended to me, like psychopaths in Wall Street.
But it's bad.
Yeah, but it's bad that these places exist. Yeah, that's another issue, right? But there's definitely like, yeah. So I think one could approach it that way by making that distinction.
Any more questions?
Thank you so much for the presentation. I always feel like there is a kind of a link between queer theories and how diagnosis in psychiatry is made.
Yeah.
And I also consider very interesting, like doing kind of a research or so in how psychiatric diagnosis is very related with gender, as it has been mentioned, also with the idea of normality.
Yeah, absolutely.
Without going to the limit of psychopathy or something like that, like for example, I think that with depression and anxiety, nowadays there's happening like a lot of, there is like a very big neurobiological perspective of them without taking on consideration like very material things or like very environmental related ones. And I think that we have to be kind of, I don't know how to say it. We have to have very clear when we are speaking about identity, which identity are we speaking about, and if it is even desirable to have that identity,
Right.
or it responds on a way to make some limits, as she has mentioned, of the ones diagnosed and the ones that are diagnosed, and how that can affect on the like well-being of the whole society and not as an individual perspective.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, I agree with all that you said. Yeah, and I mean, with queer theory, it's definitely something I want to look more into, because I read a few things, but if you know more stuff, because it's in the disability, and especially in foster psychiatry, it's fairly recent, this whole debate, but I mean, it's not recent in gender studies and in race studies, and so it's definitely something I want to look more into to see like what kind of parallel can be drawn, and surely, yeah, I mean, if it's a question of identity, then it's really relevant to look at the perspectives of people who have thought a lot more about identity. But I think it's interesting that we see this shift, which is fairly recent in psychiatry, of, well, my diagnosis is also like a very important part of my identity, or like my mental condition is a very important part of my identity, as opposed to the very like strong medical model that was super popular up to, I mean, not so long ago, where it's just like, yeah, it's a disease, and then so what I call it, the more explanatory route. So I want to either get rid of it or manage the symptoms, or go back to like being more normal. Whereas we see that now, luckily, I mean, it's more complicated than that. So thank you.
Thank you. My question is more on, because this is new for me. So as far as I understood, in the first part, the idea is that diagnose impacts people's identity, no? When they are get that diagnosed.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, I would like to know if you have thought about if there is a relation between, depending on you distinguish the explanatory role, the revelatory role, if people, depending on which role has played the diagnosis in people's identity, if the people is more willing to disclose their diagnosis or not, and follow it just for curiosity, the other side would be, as far as I understood in your talk, is the impact of disclosing the diagnosis in people. But I was wondering if there is an impact of people that disclosing the diagnosis in the context of cultural, social, if it goes the other way around, because sometimes disclosing has an impact on them, but sometimes when many people disclose it, it has an impact on them. And I want your thoughts on that.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna start with the first question, which I have like a clear, let's say clear answer to. I think it depends, because I think all of them, all of them can be like happening in all the cases that you brought. I mean, I don't see it as like one of them mapping more on the explanatory or one of them mapping more on the revelatory or the transformative.
I asked because I was thinking if for me it has, if when I got the diagnosis and it has have a revelatory impact on me in a positive way, I might be more willing to share it.
That's right.
Regardless of the stigma, for example.
Yeah.
But if it has had a negative impact, I might be more.
No, I think that makes sense. But also, I think it depends on like your specific goal in a situation. So let's say like you're depressed and so you also view your diagnosis negatively, but you're looking for empathy and support.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess in that case you're more likely to disclose that you're depressed. Or again, the alcoholic example, I think that's probably the clearest, right? You view it negatively, even if it's a big part of who you are, but then disclosing it gives you that understanding from other people that you're looking for. Or I mean, also like, I can be convinced that being autistic is a very important part of my identity, and I view it as something that's really positive. But let's say I'm in an environment where I know that people are really ableist and like, you know, I will be treated badly, and so I decide not to disclose in that kind of environment, although I'm actually very proud.
Okay.
So I think, I mean, it can work the way, of course in some cases, but I think there's also, other cases in which it wouldn't. And the second one, can you just?
Well, I was wondering if you have any thoughts on the impact of people disclosing their diagnoses in society.
Okay, but what do you have in mind here? Like more like movements or groups, like the neurodiversity group, like or like collective.
For example,
Okay.
Nowadays there are more. You can watch more TV shows where characters.
Yeah.
Where there are characters with many different conditions, and it looks like the stigma has been eroded.
Eroded, yeah.
So
Sure. So you mean like more disclosure? Yeah, I mean.
If there is a relation of more people disclosing all these kind of things happening.
Yeah.
Or maybe there is not.
Yeah. I mean, hopefully that should be the case, right? Yeah. Right. At least thinking about like other examples seems to be like that's what happened with homosexuality, for instance, right? I mean, if we think about 50 years ago and now, I mean, of course it's a complex process, but it looks like more disclosing and more representation in media and got into like a more, like slightly more accepting. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think in a way, through representation and through disclosing, one can build more acceptance, but it's one way. Yeah, one possible impact for sure. Yeah. Thank you.
Any more questions? Any more comments? No? Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thanks for bringing